What's up guys, Asian here again, another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Warden. Still one of the weaker DPS classes in the game right now. Magicka Warden did get hit with a couple of nerfs, particularly to the Bear Ultimate. The Bear Ultimate was nerfed by about 30% or so in terms of raw damage. They did receive some buffs to compensate, so the animal companions and every skill you add now adds 3% additional damage rather than 2%, but generally speaking, Magicka Wardens are, if not running in place, saw a little bit of a DPS drop. So overall, Magicka Wardens are not in a very good place right now, at least when you compare them to other ranged Magicka classes. You can still definitely pull the DPS required to basically clear all the different pieces of content in the game at whatever level that you're playing at, so even things like Cloud Rest Hard Mode, you can clear it with the Magicka Warden, but you will be working harder in order to meet those DPS checks, in order to get that high DPS that you would expect to see from like a Magicka Templar or a Magicka Nightblade. I still find Magicka Wardens to be very fun to play, and this particular build in Murkmire, because they dropped the cost of Shulks, it's going to be a little bit of a different rotation now. It's going to be very dynamic, and you're going to see a lot of bar swaps. It actually plays very similar now to a Stamina Warden and a Magicka Nightblade in just terms of just how dynamic the rotation is. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know in order to recreate this build yourself. Talk a little bit about gear substitutions in case you don't have things like Somerset or Morrowind, so that way you guys can have an idea of some alternative sets if you don't have certain DLCs or expansions. Then we'll be talking about our rotation. Because this rotation is very dynamic, there's not that much to cover. We'll pretty much jump right into a 6-man dummy Parse, just so you guys can get an idea of the DPS you can pull with this particular build. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started first with our gear as always. So our monster helm set is still going to be Zaan if you're able to basically be within melee range of the boss and the boss is not going to be moving around at all. So if Zaan is only strong in those scenarios, so if you have to move around a lot, if you aren't able to play at melee range, then you obviously can't run Zaan. In that instance, you'll be running something like Skoria instead. Skoria would probably be the next best option here. The one piece doesn't really provide that much DPS, it just provides max health, but in this instance you'll be able to basically put all of your enchants and all your points into Magicka this way, because you will have some additional health, one from the minor toughness that you can proc on yourself, as well as the health from Skoria. So those are your two primary monster helm sets that you can really choose from. So Zaan is a DLC set, so you will need to have access to Dragonbone's DLC. This drops from Scale Caller Peak, so you must have that in order to get Zaan, versus Skoria, which is base game. It's from City of Ash 2, so it is going to be a little bit difficult to obtain just because City of Ash 2 is one of the more difficult, and I'd say it's probably the most difficult base game dungeon right now. So you are going to have a little bit of a struggle to get your monster helm sets, but it is well worth it just because the amount of DPS it provides is not really matched by any other kind of two-piece bonus there. Now for our body piece, we're still going with Siroria. It's still the strongest set in the game right now for Magicka DPS. So you will need to have access to Somerset in order to get Siroria, because this does drop from Cloud Rest, so you will not be able to buy this off guild traders. I have the perfect version here, but you can go with the imperfect version. It really depends on whether or not you're able to clear Vet +1 or not, because that's where armor drops. So if you can't clear Vet +1, you don't have a group that can clear it, then you can just use the imperfect version. It's kind of up to you, depending on which set you can complete first. You do need to have all 5 pieces be exactly perfect or imperfect, so you can't mix and match them. So Siroria is going to be what's called our body set. So body sets are basically sets where the 5 pieces is active at all times, regardless of whether you're on your front bar or your back bar. So because of this, some sets are limited only to the body sets, because you always want that 5-piece active no matter what. So these are sets with static bonuses. So sets like Mother Sorrow, Julianos, those are sets that you want to keep on your body, because those 5 pieces won't carry over to your back bar. So you don't want to lose it when you swap your back bar, your VMA staff, in order to apply blockade. There are some other sets that you do want to keep on your body set as well. So if you don't have access to Somerset, then you can go with Master Architect instead. Let's see if I can find it here. Master Architect. So this comes from Hall of Fabrication, so you will need to have access to Morrowind on the other hand in order to use Master Architect. So this is here for the Major Slayer that you get from that 5-piece whenever you use your ultimate ability. Because the bear costs 75 ultimate, Master Architect is a very good fit for Wardens. That being said, you do have to run the Bear Ultimate in order to do so. So if you're not running the Bear Ultimate, Master Architect obviously loses a crap ton of power just because you aren't able to use your ultimate every other front bar rotation. So because Master Architect is a proc set, you can also run this as a front bar set as well, but generally speaking, you can run this as a body set with no real repercussions at all. So it's kind of up to you if you want to run it as your front bar set or your body set. Our primary front bar set though is going to be Spell Strategist. It's going to be a very powerful choice for single target DPS. Even though that 500 spell damage is not affected by things like sorcery or anything, it's still a very strong boost, and it does surpass Burning Spellweave in most instances. Of course, it depends on the uptime on Burning Spellweave, but it does usually end up eking out a little bit above Burning Spellweave here. So in terms of jewelry, we have 1 Arcane, 2 Bloodthirsty, and that's just because the bear is not affected by Bloodthirsty, so we don't need necessarily 3 Bloodthirsty. You do lose a little bit of power this way. And then we also have 3 spell damage enchants as well. So in terms of jewelry traits, because they buffed minor sorcery to be 10% additional spell damage versus 5%, Infused does actually end up being a viable option for Magicka DPS. So you can really have 3 jewelry options here. You have Bloodthirsty, Infused, and Arcane. Each of them have their own advantages. Typically speaking, 2 or 3 Bloodthirsty is going to be the strongest combination for a Magicka Warden, again, because Bear doesn't scale off of Bloodthirsty. 3 is a little bit, loses out a little bit to compare it to 2. And then in terms of Arcane versus Infused, Arcane will give you more resources, which is a little bit easier, it just helps out your sustain a little bit, but Infused does give you a little bit more spell damage, so it's kind of up to you which one you want to kind of invest in. Whichever one is going to end up being stronger, it does depend a little bit on your buff uptimes and things like that. So generally speaking, Arcane is going to be the safest choice between all 3 of those options, but 2 Bloodthirsty, 1 Arcane is usually going to be the strongest option. Then for our front bar, we have an Infused Inferno Staff, Spell Strategist with a Flame Damage enchant, and for our back bar, we have a Maelstrom Inferno Staff infused with an Absorb Magic enchant. That just helps out our sustain by a little bit there, and we do need to sustain. Magicka Wardens do have a little bit of a struggle sustaining, however they did buff the Netch, so it does give you a little bit more resources, so we're actually able to sustain pretty much a full light attack rotation with that Absorb Magicka enchant on our back bar here, even more so if we have something like Orb or something like that. So I already talked a little bit about potential front bar options here, and one of them was obviously Master Architect. But you could go something like Burning Spellweave, which I mentioned earlier. That's a pretty good set option for your front bar set, and then you can also go with, if you have no other option really, you can go with a static set, so something like Mother Sorrow or Julianos. Those are decent options, but generally speaking, something like Spell Strategist or Burning Spellweave or even Master Architect will usually pull out a little bit ahead of those static sets, just because you don't have that static bonus on your back bar. Now, because we do have a dynamic rotation, that kind of mitigates that worry a little bit, just because you're bar swapping very often. You're basically casting Shulks every 3rd ability, so you're on your front bar for a pretty substantial amount of time compared to some other classes, Magicka classes. So Mother Sorrow and Julianos, even though they are static 5-piece bonuses, if you have them as a front bar set, because you're on your front bar a little bit more often, it might even out a little bit. I would still recommend trying to get Spell Strategist or Burning Spellweave or Master Architect, but if you have Mother Sorrow, that is purchasable off of Guild Traders, so it's an easy set to obtain, and it is going to be pretty close to those other 3 sets that I mentioned. It might even beat it out a little bit depending on your RNG on your crits. So with all that said and done, that's all of our gear. Let's go ahead and talk about our character sheet. So we are a Dark Elf. I've played around between Dark Elves and High Elves, and I've pulled a little bit higher on average with Dark Elves. We do lose a little bit of sustain because Dark Elves do not have that 9% regen that High Elves do. But because a lot of our damage is fire damage and Dark Elves have a little bit more fire damage, I did push out a little bit ahead. We're talking less than a 1k DPS, so you can really choose whichever race you want here. A third option would be Bretons if you don't want to play Elves for whatever reason. Bretons get 10% additional max Magicka and 3% cost reduction. So that's not quite as strong as the 9% regen from High Elves, but it's still really nice for sustain. Plus they have some additional survivability because they do have 3960 additional spell resistance as well. And if you really want to, if you just decide that you also want a PvP as well, you might want to be an Argonian instead. Argonians get 3% max Magicka and 9% max health, so in terms of PvE DPS, they're not going to be quite as strong, but they do have a passive boost to their potions. Basically, each potion will restore 4,000 health, Magicka, and stamina, all 3. So basically, each potion you drink acts as a little bit of a tri-potion. So that just helps out your sustain a lot, and in PvP at least, that additional sustain does help out. So if you do think you're going to do PvP on a Magicka Warden, an Argonian might not be a bad choice here. You do end up losing some DPS on the PvE side of things, but it's not going to be anything that makes or breaks you. For attributes, 64 points into Magicka here. So that leaves our health at 15.3k. We do not have any health enchants, even with Zaan. We do have Infused on our large pieces and Divines on our small pieces, all Magicka enchants. And that's just because we do get minor toughness from our green balance passive maturation. So this procs off of any heal, and because Animal's Companions, our bond with nature does provide a heal whenever you use Shulks or your Blue Betty or even your Screaming Cliff Racer, we pretty much always have minor toughness up, so we always have the additional 10% health, so we don't need to actually put any points into health here at all, because we will always have that minor toughness going for us, so we'll always be sitting at about 16k health or so. So even though our base health is 15.3, we're actually sitting at 16k. Now, of course, you could provide a little bit more health if you want that additional survivability. You can put like 4 or 5 points into health if you'd like. You can put a health enchant on a small or a large piece. If you do put health on a large piece, you will have to swap out your Infused for Divines instead, just because an Infused on a health piece doesn't really help out your DPS, versus Divines with our Mundus Stone, that helps out our DPS a little bit more that way. For speaking of Mundus, we're going with the Thief. You can go with the Apprentice or the Thief. Those are going to be your two strongest Mundus options. You can also go with the Lover if you know you will be won't be going over the penetration cap if you have the Lover. Generally speaking, that's only going to be reserved for groups that are not running Alkosh on their tanks, and they aren't running Torg's Infused Crusher on their tanks either. Generally speaking, the Thief and the Apprentice will be a little bit stronger if you're able to reach their penetration cap without using Lovers. Then for food, we're going Clockwork Stitches Fillet. This is the gold food, health, Magicka regen. The health regen is just kind of a nice bonus there. This is kind of expensive to purchase and make because it does use Perfect Row, so don't feel like you have to use this. Witchmother's Potent Brew is a perfectly fine alternative here. And if you're feeling particularly ballsy, you could go with blue food as well. I would not recommend doing that just because it makes it very difficult to sustain without that additional Magicka regen. But again, it's kind of up to you if you want to do that or not. You could heavy attack more, you can run Spell Sim on your back bar, so that's kind of up to you if you want to use blue food in a raid or not, in a raiding scenario. Now for our skills, starting off with our front bar here, we have Screaming Cliff Racer, Deep Fissure, Blue Betty, Crushing Shock, Inner Light, and Eternal Guardian. Crushing Shock is here for the Ancient Knowledge passive boost. We're not actually going to be using it. It also provides a little bit of utility as a ranged interrupt. Then for our back bar, we have Winter's Revenge, Blockade of Fire, Fetcher Infection. This is where we would put our shield, so we have our light armor shield. You can choose Dampen or Harness Magicka. I personally prefer Dampen for the larger shield strength, but it's kind of up to you. You can choose whichever one you would like. But we're going to be using Elemental Drain just for the Parse itself. And then we have Rearming Trap. You should only use this if you're able to actually be within melee range. This does help out your sustain compared to our alternative, which is Challenge Acceleration. It's because it uses stamina versus Magicka. If you do want to use Challenge Acceleration, you will need to have Somerset. So if you don't have Somerset and you aren't able to play at melee range, you can replace Rearming Trap with something like Inner Light, or you can go with Spell Sim to help out your sustain. It's kind of up to you which one of these two abilities you want to replace Rearming Trap here. This is for the Minor Force, so if you can get it in, I highly recommend you do so, but if you can't because you have to play at range the whole time, then again, replace it with Spell Symmetry or Inner Light. Then we have our Eternal Guardian again, because we have to double bar our ultimate. Now, if you don't want to use the bear, you can run Northern Storm on your front bar, and then you can run Destro ulti on your back bar. That's up to you if you want to do that, or you can run double Destro ulti. But generally speaking, you do want the additional Magicka that you get from slotting Northern Storm on your front bar here for the additional resources that you get out of that. You will end up losing about 3 to 4k DPS that way, so you still want to run the bear as much as you can if you are deciding to run a Magicka Warden in any piece of content, really. Now for our champion points. CP cap is 810, which gives us 270 points to put across each of the 3 different constellation colors. With our green CPs, we have 75 into Arcanist and 75 into Tenacity. That leaves 120 points, which you can really divide however you'd like. So I have 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, 40 Warlord, but you can, again, split them however you'd like. You can push Arcanist or Tenacity up to 100 for that last percentage point and put the remaining 70 points wherever you'd like. It's kind of up to you. It's really whatever fits your trial that you're running or whatever you want to do best. For our blue CPs, we are assuming we are in a optimized group, so we're running Alkosh, we have good Alkosh uptime, we're running Torg's Crusher, we have good Torg's Crusher uptime, we have a Stamplar running Power of the Light, so we have our Minor Breach going. So that's what this particular build is kind of based on. If you don't have any of those uptimes, if you don't have Alkosh or something like that, you might need to put more points into Spell Erosion to make up for that loss in penetration. So I have 25 points here, but you can drop Elfborn down to 61. You can drop Thaumaturge down to 37. You can drop Master at Arms down to 61 as well. So you can drop them down 1 percentage point or so. You can drop Ellie Expert down 56 if you must. So to put some more points into Spell Erosion here. 66 Elfborn, 64 Ellie Expert, 25 Spell Erosion, 9 Staff Expert, 66 Master at Arms, and then 40 into Thaumaturge. Now for our red CPs, I take a one-size-fits-most approach with these builds, but if you want to maximize your mitigation for any specific piece of content, you will need to adjust your CPs accordingly, depending on what content that you are running. So we have 81 into Ironclad, 61 into Thickskin, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Do want to point out Field Physician passive here, which reduces the damage you take while resurrecting another player by 15%. You do need 10 points into the Lord, so you can put 10 points into Quick Recovery, just because Bastion is pretty much useless in PvE right now. So 10 points here will give you the Field Physician passive, so you can basically drop Ironclad down to 66 if you'd like, and then put 10 points into Quick Recovery, and then put the remaining 5 points into Thickskin, so 66 into Ironclad and Thickskin rather than 81-61, so if you want to put those 10 points here instead. So that's pretty much all of our build information, so let's go ahead and go over our rotation. So like I mentioned, we are doing a dynamic rotation. It's actually quite dynamic because the purpose here is we're going to try to use Shulks as much as possible. So Shulks has a 3-second cooldown, so to speak, before it does damage. So you cast Shulks, 3 seconds later you do the damage. So you can think of it as a 3-second dot. If you think of it like that, then when you initially cast Shulks, that's second 1, and then you basically have 2 global cooldowns, so 2 abilities, and then Shulk goes off, and then you have to recast Shulk. So basically your rotation is centered around Shulks. So you do Shulk, ability, ability, Shulk, ability, ability, Shulk, and so on and so forth. So you're basically going to be constantly bar swapping. You're going to be maintaining an eye on all your dots. So I highly recommend picking up Surrender or Action Duration Reminder, or even both of them if you are on PC. Unfortunately, console players, you don't have add-ons, so you will need to rely on the built-in buff tracker in order to kind of maintain, keep an eye on your dots and things like that. So your basis behind a Magicka Warden rotation is basically Shulks. Shulks, 2 abilities, Shulks, 2 abilities, Shulks, 2 abilities, and so on and so forth. That's basically your entire rotation. And if you decide to use the ultimate, your bear ultimate, that also counts as ability. So you can do something like Shulks, Blockade, bear ultimate, Shulks, Winter's Revenge, Fetcher Infection, Shulks, Betty Net, Blue Betty, and Cliff Racer, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of this whole centerpiece behind the rotation. So real quick, just kind of show you guys what I'm talking about here. We'll do it on this dummy here. So you do basically do something like Shulks, 2 abilities, Shulks, and then you do 2 abilities again, 2 abilities. So you can see basically how 2 abilities pretty much lines up with your Shulks. So that's kind of the whole basis. That's what I mean when I say it's the basis of our rotation. It's always going to be Shulks 2, Shulks 2, Shulks 2. So because of that, it's a very dynamic rotation. It's basically going to be something like a 50,000 step rotation essentially, because it's just so dynamic. It's the only thing you really have to worry about is just casting Shulks every 3rd ability. And naturally, that does mean there is going to be some downtime on your dots, especially on your backbar dots. So if you do need to kind of break your dots, like decrease your uptime, the 2 dots that I would say you want to maintain as much uptime as you possibly can is going to be Blockade, and then if you are running Rearming Trap or Challenge Acceleration, that Minor Force, whatever your source of Minor Force is. If you're not running Minor Force, then it's going to be Blockade and Winter's Revenge. Those are going to be your 2 main dots that you're going to want to maintain at all times. I would prioritize keeping those dots up versus Shulks. So if you have to do something like Shulks and then 3 abilities to maintain Blockade and then cast Shulks again, that's perfectly fine, just because you want Blockade down for the VMA passive boost to your light attacks. You also want Rearming Trap or whatever your source of Minor Force is for the additional crit damage. So we're just going to go ahead and summon our bear here, and then we'll do a 6-mana dummy Parse. You're going to want to compare this Parse to other Magicka DPS specs, so other, for example, a Magicka Templar or a Magicka Nightblade. You just keep in mind, if you are wanting to compare this to Magicka Nightblades do have Minor Berserk built into their skills, so you will need to add 8% DPS or so to kind of get a more accurate comparison between a Nightblade and a Magicka Warden. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. I kind of had a really messy start here with our rotation, but that should all even out in the end. You can just kind of get an idea of just how often I am bar swapping right off the get-go. So remember, our ultimate does count as an ability. You can see here there's not really a rhyme or reason to the order that I'm doing certain skills. It's just a matter of prioritizing that Shulk cast every third ability. Try not to let blockade or any of your backbar dots drop if you can help it. Unfortunately, just the nature of this rotation basically means you will have some downtime on your dots, your backbar dots. So bar swaps don't actually count as an ability, just so you guys are aware. So it's not like you can do ability bar swap Shulks. You still will need to cast an ability after your bar swap. There we go, that is our Parse here. Just need to unsummon the bear because we do have our second trap out and that's not going to go away. So here we are, here's our Parse here, 42.7k. Actually did a little bit better on an earlier Parse. Let's see if I have it here. I do have it, so 44.2k, that's actually the highest Parse that I managed to get on a Magicka Warden. And I think the primary reason here is I think I had higher crits on this one compared to here. So yeah, a little bit higher crit, so that's kind of why this DPS is a little bit higher. But you can reasonably expect anywhere between 43 and 44 on a solo self-buffed Parse on a Magicka Warden here. So you can see here, Shulk's very strong ability here, very nice in terms of the amount of cleave damage you can get out of it, 24k burst damage every 3 seconds, so that pretty much works out to be about 7k DPS or so when you look at the average here, so 7k DPS. Really nice, it beats out blockade, it beats out Fetch Infection, beats out Winter's Revenge. Shulks is going to be your main source of DPS. Light attacks are a little bit disproportionately represented here just because of the nature of a dummy Parse where you don't have to play mechanics or anything. But Deep Fissure will always be the highest contributor to your DPS, generally speaking. Absorb Magicka and Fire Weapon, you can see here they are both really nice to have. That Absorb Magicka does provide some additional regen, about 190 if you're able to proc it on cooldown. And it just helps our sustain here. So we're sitting at about 170 disparity between regen and drain. So pretty decent. So even though we did get a little bit of a DPS nerf, we got some sustain bonuses and we did get a little bit of a buff to Shulks themselves. So that gives us some really nice cleave damage now. Comparable to that of some other cleave damage from other classes as well. That being said though, even if you do add that minor berserk bonus here, so if we add about 8% or so to here, we'd be adding in about 3.6k DPS, so we'd be sitting at around 48k or so. So it's still pretty respectable overall, but generally speaking, Magicka Nightblades are going to be ending up pulling out a little bit ahead of Magicka Wardens, and same thing with Templars. Templars are going to be pulling out ahead compared to Magicka Wardens as well. But I find Magicka Wardens very fun to play. That dynamic rotation, very involved, very fun with all the bar swaps that you have to do. So I personally love playing Magicka Warden, and so even though it doesn't pull the best DPS, I just like having a bear out and seeing the bear maul things. So that's it for this build video. Let me know down in the comment section below if you guys have any questions or comments about this build. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.